day one, I woke at 5 AM in readiness for my flight, London to Reykjavik. Upon arrival, I loaded up my hire car and spent a little longer than expected picking up supplies. I arrived at Fjallabak at 5 PM and took my time to assemble, load and fine-tune my bike and bags. A bit more time spent here, I figured, should save me having to stop to tighten straps and find and fix rattles later on. The first 15 kilometres or so was on undulating, rural, well-paved roads, making the going easy, until it wasn't. As the main road ended, the F-road began. These are reserved for off-road vehicles only, and I was quickly introduced to the boulder-strewn, bone-jangling terrain with which I would quickly become familiar.
"30 kilometres in so far, and there's no one here. It is absolutely remote. Beautiful, but remote. I cannot stop grinning to myself as I'm bouncing along these roads. It's an absolute dream come true.
During my planning, I'd shared my route into the Icelandic search and rescue, asking for feedback. They replied and told me to leave my water filter at home, as all water in Iceland is drinkable. It is naturally volcanically filtered and so cold that bacteria cannot exist in it. However, the reality of the situation dawned on me when the first 35 kilometres of riding and hiker bike had taken 4.5 hours. I was down to my last half a litre of water with 15 kilometres still to go. Every source of water was either still, sulphur-encrusted pools or fast-flowing glacial runoff. The latter would have been perfect for filtration, and, had I brought my water filter with me, would have allowed me to make camp on the trail. Instead, I was forced to press on through the night to reach the first mountain hut, Emstra Camp, at which I hoped to replenish my water supplies.
I just had to push my bike and all the kit all the way down there, all the way, things hanging up here, still not done.
A couple of hours in, I turned a corner and rode through a dark and windswept gully that led towards the iconic ICELAND or Unicorn Mountain, a feature that belies its cutesy name, the husk of a caldera, evidence of an ancient explosive force punctuating an otherworldly moonscape. I navigated by head torch for 3 hours at the Icelandic dusk, the low light masking the rocks and soft volcanic sand. After coming off my bike 3 times, bloodying my knee, I finally arrived at camp at 2 AM, some 7.5 hours after departing, my ego dented, but not my resolve. Exhausted, I set up camp, made food, and drifted off to sleep. Rain lashing up my tent at 8 AM, I made my way to the camp mess tent to make breakfast and coffee. After packing my tent and gear in the rain, I happened to speak to a park ranger. Having told her of my plans to head to Landmannalaugar for the day, she looked at me with a face of obvious consternation and said, "How good are you on that bike through snow?" My heart sank as she told me no one had driven through there in weeks, as the pass was closed due to heavy snow. The only glimmer of hope was to head to the next hut, a mere 30 kilometres away, for an update. I'd come equipped for all manner of mechanical breakdown and emergency situations, but with only mountain bike and water shoes, I knew I wasn't properly clothed for snowdrift or blizzard conditions. Moreover, my bike certainly wasn't. Skidding around in the soft ash the night before was akin to trying to ski off-piste in rollerblades, so actually taking my 40-kilo behemoth through snow didn't seem like a brilliant idea. Although not on my original plan, I felt it difficult to justify not following the ranger's advice, and I continued onward to detour into the next hut. The cloud hugged the mountain tops and the rain was unforgiving as I hauled my bike up the road I'd crashed down several times the night before. A quick map check at a fork in the road led me to take a right turn, handrailing 2 adjacent mountains, cutting a corner to skirt eastwards in the direction of my new destination.
And it's taken me 32 minutes to go 1.5k on sand, like riding through a cloud on the moon. It is absolutely mental.
Streets outside your window, overflowing. People staring, they know you've grown. Repeatedly reminded by the looks on their faces you've grown. Repeatedly reminded by the looks on their faces you've grown.
An hour later, and I was confronted by a stunning vista, the kind of Arctic tundra which defies belief, such that one's eyes are unable to absorb the intense details. Couloirs, ravines, waterfalls, rapids below, and above them, glacier. Ah, oh dear. Glacier. The track had faded into nothing, and all that was before me was impassable wilderness. As I scrambled to check my map and get my bearings, my heart sank for the second time that day. I'd taken a wrong turn and was now seriously off course, having wasted significant time and energy, and was going to have to expend even more getting back on track. The trail down to where I stood was the softest, steepest ashen rock I had encountered, and hauling back up the mountain took all my effort. Once back onto a plain, the alien landscape appeared featureless and misleading. At a fork in the road, I needed to climb to higher ground to assess the way back. Only by checking photos I'd taken along the way could I be sure of the way I'd come in. Some 2 hours had been wasted getting lost in the wild, but it had taught me an invaluable lesson. This landscape would not be kind to a weary bikepacker. To make a mistake like that, at night, and on a snowed-in mountain road, would be tantamount to suicide. Some 10 kilometres or so later, I happened upon my first proper river crossing, and the first people I met. The hikers, a couple from New York, confirmed to me that the mountain pass to La Manalaga was indeed snowed in and closed to wheeled traffic. The remainder of the day was tough going, mentally and physically, as I wrestled with the idea of not completing my route as planned. Several sections of uphill hiker bike and more river crossings, the largest one thankfully boasting an old elevated footbridge, ensued as I travelled deeper into the wilderness. Passing through the breathtaking terrain, mountains glowed, lush, green and black, adorned with patches of lifting haze. Saturated hills were persecuted of the day's rain by the evening sun, and the weather attempted to break. It was now 7 p.m. The unrelenting sequence of stopping to change from cycle to water shoes, crossing through deep, icy rivers, drying my feet and legs on the other side before putting bike shoes back on again, took far longer than expected. This, plus my navigation error earlier in the day, had meant that I had ridden and hauled for almost 8 hours, but made only 30 kilometres of ground. The trail, with its undulating, blind corners and false summits, shrouded my destination until I was almost upon it. The lake, and with it the camp of Aftervatten, was a welcome sight when it came. This, I decided, would be my camp for the night, mindful to learn lessons from the previous night's misadventure. After making camp, I cleaned the cuts on my hands and knees, made dinner, and passed out exhausted in my tent.
Windy Iceland.
I woke to the familiar sound of wind and rain lashing my tent. the incessant weather gave me excuse to pause to plan several courses of action. I was keen to get to Landmannalaugar via a different route than the snowed-in mountain pass, and it was only 53 kilometres away. The other huts, Landmannahilla and Dalakafin, were shorter at 40 and 30 kilometres respectively. As I'd need to pass each of them to get to Landmannalaugar anyway, they presented me with two natural outs, which I could use depending on my pace, the terrain, and weather throughout that day. But to fixate on the distance was not the right way to measure success. The real challenge was to survive and thrive in the wild, pushing the envelope by riding some of the most formidable terrain in Europe, if not the world. My destination set, the rain became a deluge as I summited a nearby mountain. At the desert floor, a river crossing came into view. Bored of the previous day's stop-start rhythm, and with my GoPro rolling, I opted for a send it moment, rather than be sensible and stop to change shoes. I careered into the river without having any real sense of how deep it was, other than following some 4x4 tyre tracks and hoping for the best. It was no more than 5 metres wide, and the water was clear, so I instinctively reasoned that I could get through it without a problem. As I rode through the stream at pace, I quickly realised it was much deeper than anticipated. My cranks, and with them my pedals and feet, were completely underwater, and I climbed up the other side of the river with all the grace of a pedalo, legs thrashing as fast as the water would allow, my now completely soaked cycling shoes housing my soaking wet socks and freezing cold feet.
It's the reward. Soaking wet socks and shoes. The rest of the day. I'm not complaining.
With only myself to blame for my soaking wet shoes, rather than be frustrated, I felt cheerful. And this was magnified whenever small windows of sunshine made the breathtaking vista sparkle. Green and black as before, but now red and white too. Cosmic variations from algae, ash, iron and snow. Despite the wind, rain, terrain and relentless gradients, I found myself bathing in the Fjallabak's otherworldly majesty. I was also now in uncharted territory, at least so far as documented bikepacking routes go. The route I'd intended to follow had been taken and replanned from an article on bikepacking.com, whereas I was now simply following the map, unaware of how passable or otherwise the terrain might be. After 2 hours of climbing, the canyon opened up, and I descended 200 metres to the bottom of a valley. My bike's disc brakes squealing as they burned off volcanic deposits under the weight of its substantial load. At the valley floor I was confronted by an intimidating challenge, the largest river on my route. I had descended into a 200-metre wide glacial floodplain. This was not part of my original route, and now presented a significant obstacle. The river was interspersed with sporadic shale islands, and presented me with a random array of possible crossing points or dead ends, with no obvious path through. Although I could make out a 4x4 route, as I'd learned, these weren't necessarily passable on foot carrying a bike, and had I followed similar routes earlier on my journey, I would have found myself chest deep or swimming in the icy waters. Taking time to recce the riverbanks had served me well so far, and was not about to be a habit I would be breaking here. The river was fast flowing deceptively deep in places. The shale banks presented assistance and a problem. Although I could try to walk and carry my bike to each bank, they were raised enough to obstruct my view, especially so once down in the water, meaning I was not able to properly assess the crossing before fully committing to it. It was here that the remoteness and conditions came into stark focus for me. One wrong move and I knew that I could be submerged and, assuming I could haul myself out, quickly hypothermic. Although trying to maintain a positive mindset, I also visualised my actions on in the event of being immersed in the river. When finally safely across, I yelled with joy and relief at my small but important achievement. I hadn't pushed and ridden more than 4 kilometres when I wished I hadn't taken the time to change out of my water shoes. The route ahead was riddled with smaller streams and rivers, each one too deep to ride through, knee to mid-thigh deep, or with shale banks too soft to ride with enough speed to cross without dismounting. After a quick map check, I made the decision to ride for the next 10 kilometres in my water shoes. These offered me less protection on the hiker bike sections and practically zero insulation. Soon, I couldn't feel my feet for the rest of the day, although this meant that the sharp rocks underfoot soon stopped being much of a distraction. They also offered me speed, which I had not enjoyed so far on this leg of my journey, as to constantly change in and out of shoes and drying feet during this section would have slowed me significantly. If it wasn't so beautiful here, I might be tempted to be pissed off, because this is about the 10th river crossing in a row, so I've taken to cycling in my surf boots. Feet are absolutely freezing. Once through the last of the back-to-back rivers and into my cycling shoes, I enjoyed riding the meandering valley tracks and through Death Valley-esque boulder fields. As I did so, I became mindful of how much further I'd need to ride to get to Landmannalaugar. Double the distance I'd ridden, waded and hiked to that point on day 3. I also had no way of knowing just how rideable the track might be ahead. Whilst I was grateful that today's route had been passable so far, I felt it would be wise not to push my luck. Given the conditions and terrain, I reluctantly decided to head for the Lakafin hut, the first of my outs, and barely 30 kilometres from where I'd started my day. I also wanted to give myself the best chance of getting off the national park and back to my car within 72 hours. Keen not to underestimate the 70 kilometres I'd be tackling the next day, the longest leg of the challenge, I made peace with my decision.
Stop.
I was welcomed at Lakafin by a man named Gustav, a charismatic mountain man in his 60s who politely introduced himself in English as the warden. As I set up my camp, I was invited to eat with a friendly group of 12 Icelandic hikers. I was soon treated to a glass of red wine as I tucked into some delicious home-cooked Icelandic fare. My feet finally thawed, and I felt humbled to be experiencing such a welcome from complete strangers. Gustav's eyes sparkled as he regaled stories about the hut, the surrounding area and his family. He told me that the cabin had been built by his father, whom he idolised, and to whom he credited with his aspiration of being an outdoorsman. Sadly, his father passed away at the age of 58 of a heart attack whilst doing what he loved in a place that he loved, snowmobiling on a nearby mountain. Gustav paused and said something to me I'll never forget. My father was a mountain man, a man who, when he died, was alive. Do you understand? He was taken too young, but he died alive. Then, narrowing his eyes, he pointed at me and said, "Maybe one day you will die on your bike, but if you do, you too will die alive." Whilst moved by his poignancy and vigour, I replied, "That may be so, Gustav, but not tomorrow. I have plans." Feeling physically and mentally both exhilarated and exhausted, I retired to my tent for the night. The day had not gone to plan, but had given me everything I needed, and more. I'd shivered restless in my tent for much of the previous night. The Lakafin's 800-metre elevation combined with a clear night sky, for the first time bringing with it the cold. To rejuvenate myself, I decided to take a short walk to a nearby river for a much-needed wash, braving the freezing water for a spot of Icelandic skinny dipping. Whilst I'm accustomed to cold water plunge pools at home, this was breathtakingly cold and exactly what I needed to reawaken for the day's riding ahead of me. First time, the sun shone undeterred by the threat of rain clouds, and ultraviolet rays transformed the landscape. From the high ground, My eyes could barely process the immeasurable expanse. Monochromic lava fields, subarctic black sand desert tundra, vertiginous river-threaded valleys, and mountains dashed snow-white and chartreuse. Glowing photosynthesis in movement. Opportunistic life, thriving in our planet's harshest of terrains. As I careered down the trail from Delacafin, I was almost thrown off my bike a couple of times. To be fair, this was when my focus was overtaken by overindulgence. The broadest of grins and cowboy style
Fucking go!
yells to myself and no one else were followed by the need to quickly attempt to bunny hop a hidden crater or divot that would have sent me flying. After the second near miss, I thought it better to rein it in until the tracks were more forgiving. For the next few hours I cycled through a wide black sand valley flanked with snow-capped hills, much of which was fast and enjoyable, until the terrain shifted once again. The sand unceremoniously began to soften and give way once more, and I was almost thrown from my saddle again without warning. Then the trail meandered upwards, its surface compacting as it rose, aiding my ability to climb. The bike felt more nimble than before, as I had taken only essential rations with me, leaving any spares for the hikers. As I followed the trail up and over, hand-railing a nearby river, I noticed the volcano Hekla, long overdue an eruption and a prominent feature here.
Does she love you better than I can?
My drone was my only companion, and in the inclement weather, it was more than a little temperamental, appearing to have a life of its own at times. I quickly realised that it was too slow to keep up with me downhill, but on my final day in the Fjallabak, I decided to have some fun with it anyway. The drone, my own digital version of Wilson from the Tom Hanks movie Castaway.
I know it's stupid, but just gotta see it for myself. I'm in the corner.
As I crossed the bridge, I found myself suddenly in the mix with hundreds of other riders all trying to complete the last 30 kilometres of the Rift gravel race. The looks and comments some of them gave me as I hurtled along, now with 35 kgs plus of bike and equipment, were priceless. And the award for most cargo goes to, was my favourite from one American competitor. As I entered the final 15 kilometres of my route, a backlog of 4x4 vehicles came into view. As I got closer, I could see they were waiting to cross a section of short but tricky river crossings. I could also see a few of the riders who had passed me a few kilometres or so ago, standing, watching and wondering how to get through without getting their feet wet. I took this as my cue to nip past them and ride death or glory style into the water, overtaking the SUVs as I did so. Unsurprisingly, I was quickly in the water above my axles, my feet thrashing in the water as I once more activated pedalo mode. The track changed quickly from unpaved and rocky to rural dirt roads, the terrain now lush, green and arable, expanding downhill with the ocean coming into view. The dark silhouettes of the Westerman Islands jutting ominously out of the North Sea in the middle distance. The downhill to the main road was fast and smooth, flanked unusually by thickets of trees, and to the right a waterfall in full bore, streaking into a river which traced us adjacent to the trail. As I rode into the town, I realised that inexplicably the finish of the Rift Gravel Race 2024 was about 30 metres from where I parked my car more than 70 hours ago. As I approached, one of the MCs cheering on the finishers started calling me out and applauding. I had no choice but to accept this misguided praise and continue to ride through the finish line, whereby I dismounted my bike and was immediately handed a finisher's patch and a free can of beer. Amused, grateful and not wanting to be rumbled, I quickly made my way back to the car, stopping my bike computer and GPS watch after 71 hours on the trail.
Hey gents, just letting you know I'm back in the car 71 hours after I left. Fuck me, that was hard work. But amazing adventure, can't wait to tell you all about it. arse off the lot of you. Now I am off to Reykjavik for a pint. And a shower. So I'll drop you some pictures and whatnot later. But yeah, that was epic. See you soon. Love you. Bye.